Welcome to this edition of the Co-Management Commons podcast. My name is Jamie Snook, and really excited that many of you have decided to give this a shot and learn more about Canadian-based Indigenous co-management with a particular emphasis in the North. And this upcoming episode is a little bit different in the sense that it's a clip or presentation from a recent co-management class that I delivered at Dalhousie University's Marine Affairs program, and I teach the community-based co-management course in that particular department. And recently we invited in Mr. Ernie Cooper from ecooper.ca as somebody who's a world expert on the trade of wildlife species. I first met Ernie back in 2010 at a CITES convention in Thailand, where he was very actively involved in all of the processes, but in particular had been a co-author on a report that had to do with polar bears. So in this particular class, I invited him to come and explain what the CITES convention is. And ever since that time in 2010, Ernie has continued to study and analyze polar bear harvest and trade from Canada in the years since. So in this podcast, he'll go over the results of that in the last 10 years and highlight some major changes that have been occurring. And if you're watching this podcast on a video format, you'll also see the slides that he presented. I hope you enjoy, and really grateful to Ernie to come and speak about this, because polar bear management is a critical issue for people involved in co-management in the Canadian North, and we're very dedicated to staying current on this topic. So enjoy.
So CITES stands for the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, even though it actually isn't focused mainly on endangered species. But I'll get to that. So CITES is a treaty between nations that was initially signed in 1975 by 10 countries. And CITES has grown since then to now include 183 parties, so members of the convention. Basically, that's 182 countries, plus the European Union is also a member as a party, so not representing a country. So 183 countries have agreed to manage their international trade in wildlife per the terms of CITES, and that's pretty amazing. You know, it can be difficult to get two countries to agree to something. 183. Every major trading country in the world is now a member of CITES. What CITES does is it lists species of concern on one of three appendices: Appendix 1, Appendix 2, and Appendix 3. Appendix 1 species are considered endangered. The feeling is that they will become extinct if trade is not seriously restricted. In order to trade a species, and when I say species, I mean any part, piece, derivative of one of these species. To trade one internationally requires both an export permit from the country of export and an import permit from the country of import. And before these countries issue their permits, they have to do a number of things, such as be able to confirm that the trade is legal, that the trade is sustainable, and that it's for a non-commercial purpose. So you cannot trade Appendix 1 species for purely commercial purposes. Appendix 2 species are not actually considered endangered. Appendix 2 species are species that might become endangered if trade is not regulated. So in order to trade an Appendix 2 species, you require a CITES export permit from the country of export, but nothing is required by the importing country. And Appendix 2 species make up the vast majority of the species listed by CITES. Appendix 3 is a little harder to explain. Appendix 3 is a mechanism whereby any country, any party, can list a species found within their borders that they're concerned about. So export of an Appendix 3 species from the country that listed it is essentially the same as Appendix 2. They require an export permit. But export from another country that did not list it, there's no permit required. What is required is a certificate of origin to show that it really didn't originate from the country that listed it. An example of an Appendix 3 species is Russell's viper. That's a better one. Another species of snake, which is traded for, amongst other things, for its leather. If you want to export a Russell's viper from India or a pair of boots made from Russell's viper, you require a CITES export permit. But on the other hand, Russell's viper ranges all through Asia. If you wanted to import a Russell's viper from, say, Malaysia, there's no permits required, just a certificate of origin. And Appendix 3 species make up a very small proportion of the species listed on CITES. Last I checked, there were somewhere around 34,000 species listed on the appendices of CITES. So again, you've got 183 countries working together to regulate trade in 34,000 some odd species. It's a pretty serious success story in that case. And it's worth noting that no species once listed on CITES has gone extinct because of trade. So it's got a pretty remarkable track record. There is one species that I know of that did go extinct, but not because of trade. And that's the ink sea dolphin, which went extinct because of pollution, toxins, harassment, etc., not trade. Another really significant thing to know about CITES is where, as far as I know, every other treaty that I know of, decisions are made by consensus. So all the parties have to agree to a change to anything that the treaty is going to do. And that tends to really water down decisions because everybody has to agree. So most decisions coming out of treaties will be, well, you should do this, or it'd be best if countries do this, but there's no penalty if they don't. CITES is different. Every 2-3 years, there's a meeting of the Conference of Parties. So all the countries get together to discuss issues, either changes to how the text is interpreted or how things are implemented, or changes to the list of species. What comes out of these meetings is decisions, which are short-term decisions, like the parties will have a workshop next year. Okay, it's finite, it happens, and it's done. There's resolutions, which are long-term interpretations of how CITES is implemented. So you might have a resolution saying that trees grown in a monoculture plantation will not require CITES permits, something like that. And that's what's long-term. And the third is, of course, changes to the list of species on the appendices. But if the parties do not come to a consensus on any of these decisions, then it goes to a vote. And the vote is carried by a 2/3 majority. When the CITES appendices are changed, when new species are added, countries must ensure their national legislation implements it. Anytime there's a change to CITES, countries need to change their national legislation. And those changes are based on a 2/3 majority, which means potentially 1/3 of the parties could be forced to change their national legislation because the other countries want them to. That's huge. That's kind of unheard of. You've got discussions, a 20-minute discussion, and then a vote. And just like that, countries have to change their laws. It's pretty intense. Things are very fast moving. And if a party does not implement CITES as per the terms of the convention, there's a number of things that could happen The biggest stick being trade sanctions. The CITES can issue a notification saying that countries should not trade with that country, either a specific species or a blanket no more wildlife trade. That's a huge, huge stick. Countries tend to take CITES very seriously. It has implications, and that kind of ties into polar bears.
Yeah, I was just wondering what the time frame surrounding, if it goes to a vote and a decision is made and there's countries that are forced to make changes to their legislation, how long do they have to do that? Because I imagine they might try to put it off. What's the time frame
They
surrounding
have
that?
90 days, which in the political world is really short.
This might be something that you're going to go into when we get to the polar bear part, but in the case where a species is very limited in terms of its the number of countries it occurs in, if something's in the interest of the country who actually has that species, how does it work when a majority of countries that don't even manage or have research being done, how can they overwhelm a country that does the research themselves?
Well, you're touching on a pretty contentious point within CITES. There's a long history of exactly that happening. For instance, the European Union, those countries all vote as a bloc. So they vote, one vote provides 35 votes, or 36, whatever it is. And so there has been a lot of frustration on the part of especially developing countries who have basically been forced to list species, to change their laws and all that by Western countries. And it has not been an equitable process. It kind of came to a head in the 90s when I think it was Zimbabwe proposed listing of the Atlantic herring in Appendix 1. And of course, all the European countries, North American countries was like, you can't do that. And that was the point. The point they were making is, there should be good reason, and the countries that are being affected need to have a good say in the process. And so now it's not a rule, but it's sort of an understanding where only range states should be submitting proposals. There really is this feeling that only the range states should be proposing species. But it is tough, and species are not always listed based on absolute need or that they actually meet the scientific requirements. Species are listed for political reasons all the time, or species are listed because nobody cares. You'll often see species of frogs from South and Central America will get proposed purely for political reasons because it looks good for a country to propose a species. And the rest of the world doesn't really care. There's no economic impact. So therefore, sure, we'll list it. In contrast with when the bluefin tuna was proposed, which would have shut down a billion-dollar industry, it was a big fight, and the big guns shut that down. So politics is unfortunately incredibly important in CITES.
I think that's a good segue into the whole polar bear case study because
Indeed.
Canada certainly has had a lot of involvement at CITES because of polar bear.
Yes, I thought maybe what I could do is give you a quick little bit of background about how I got sucked into the whole world of polar bears, which is because of CITES. I didn't have any expertise in polar bears up until I think it was around 2008 or 2009. I'm not exactly sure. And they decided what they needed was some trade reports, specifically for polar bears, narwhal, and walrus, because nobody really had a good handle on what was happening with those species in the way of international trade. And so they then reached out to me and my team in Vancouver because they thought that I would be a good fit for us to prepare these reports. I didn't realize at the time that there was the expectation that we would come back and say, oh yeah, polar bears are endangered, they should be in Appendix 1. Narwhal, which are Appendix 2 now, should be on Appendix 1 because they're endangered. And walruses, which are in Appendix 3, should be in Appendix 2. But these species are all horribly endangered. So there were people that weren't really happy when we came back and said, well, no, polar bears aren't endangered. They're certainly not threatened by trade. Just once we crunched some data and numbers. They don't belong in Appendix 1. They don't meet the criteria for Appendix 1. Narwhal don't meet the criteria for Appendix 1. Walrus is confusing. And but that's what the data came back. Then shortly after that, the U.S. suddenly proposed polar bears for CITES Appendix 1. And that was done for purely political reasons. It's a long story. The poop hit the fan. Canada took this very seriously because, as I mentioned, an Appendix 1 listing means no commercial trade. Canada is the only country in the world that commercially exports polar bears. Canada has most of the world's polar bears. And they're hunted by the Inuit. An Appendix 1 listing was not going to just hurt Canada, but it was just going to hurt the Inuit. And it was especially going to be hard on small communities where, making money is really tough. If you're up in the Arctic, things are A, really expensive, and B, it's hard to make money. So one of the ways that communities can make money is by selling wildlife products. And a polar bear hide can be very valuable. Inuit communities can also, if they choose, allocate polar bear tags to sport hunt, which means that then somebody who's not in the community can come in and go and hunt the polar bear. If a sport hunter comes in, there's conditions. One, they have to be guided by a local, and they can only travel by dog sled. They can't go out on machines to go and hunt a polar bear. And this brings up a bit of a dilemma for northern communities because a polar bear hide, if you're lucky, might bring in a couple of $1,000s to that individual. But a sport hunt will bring in about $35,000. So that's a much bigger chunk of cash for the community. But there is only a very limited number of polar bear tags issued every year. And hunting a polar bear has really strong cultural significance. It's a big deal if you get a polar bear tag. A hunter may go half his life before he gets a chance to hunt a polar bear. So an Appendix 1 listing of polar bear would shut that down. And it would hurt the Inuit. So Canada took this very seriously and started working to oppose this proposal. The animal welfare groups and conservation groups jumped on this opportunity because polar bears are high profile. Everybody around the world knows what a polar bear is. Most of these groups really wanted to be involved in polar bears because it was good for their profile and really good for fundraising. The groups that were leading this leaned on WWF to also join. So we were pressured very hard to support the idea of listing the polar bear in Appendix 1. And we wouldn't because that's not what the data suggested. It became a real bun fight, and the most political species I've ever dealt with is polar bears. The long and the short of it is, at the next meeting, the U.S. Submitted their proposal. It was debated, and they lost. So the polar bear did not go to Appendix 1. 3 years later, the U.S. proposed polar bear for Appendix 1 again. And this time they were more organized and they had the support of Russia. Canada again mobilized very effectively. And after a 2-hour debate, the most interesting debate I've ever seen at a CITES COP, it eventually was defeated. As a part of this whole process, this threat of listing the polar bear in Appendix 1, it was recognized that Canada really did not have a handle on international trade of polar bears. So by that time, I had left WWF, and they asked me to do a report, and that's when I did my first report on polar bear trade. So I did a polar bear trade report, which looked at the harvest levels of polar bears and their trade, and the conclusion was that trade was not a threat to polar bears. It's sea ice loss that's threatening polar bears, not trade. Fast forward to about 3 years ago, all of a sudden Norway started making noise about possibly proposing the polar bear for Appendix 1. So Canada then asked me to write a follow-up report. Basically, okay, what's been happening in the years since my first report to see if it has become a problem since. What their thoughts were is that they didn't think that trade was an issue, so they wanted to try and nip this initiative in the bud. And that's essentially what happened. I did my report. It took a couple of years. It was a pretty intense report, but clearly trade is not a threat. And basically the issue sort of went away. It was a real luxury to revisit an issue and see what's been happening since my previous report. And I ended up with a 20-year timeline of trade in polar bears, which is really cool. I mean, that's just nice to have such a big data. So this is actually a presentation I made shortly after I did the report. So looking at polar bear harvest, down to polar bears between 2012 and 2021, in that period, there were a total of 5,329 polar bears that were reported killed in Canada. Of all of those bears, 80% were taken in Nunavut, 9% in Quebec, 8% in the ISR, which is the Nunavut settlement region, which essentially is Northwest Territories and Yukon together. And 2% were taken from Newfoundland and Labrador. Less than 1% were killed in Ontario and Manitoba combined. Manitoba and Ontario do not allow hunting, but there are a few bears killed every year through accident or for self-defense, that sort of thing. So there's no real surprise to those numbers. The vast majority are taken in Nunavut, and the vast majority of polar bears are in Nunavut. In fact, the majority of the world's polar bears range through Nunavut. Now, the other thing that's kind of important is that while all these jurisdictions have a maximum allowable take, Quebec doesn't. Outside of the offshore waters of the southern Hudson Bay portion of the Nunavut Marine region, under treaty, they are allowed a minimum of 42 bears per year, as opposed to a maximum. It's the total number that were reported, and I'll talk about that a bit more. Of the bears killed in Canada, 79% were killed for subsistence. Again, not a surprise, given that polar bears are hunted almost exclusively by Inuit and First Nations. 12% were taken for defense of life or property, 8% for sport, 1% were illegal kills, and less than 1% were reported as miscellaneous. So I want to point out that's a very, very low number of illegal kills. And when it comes to polar bears, illegal hunting is just not a problem, unlike for many other species. That's a good thing. During this period, there were 3,415 male and 1,892 female bears killed, with about 22 animals not identified as the sex. The number of males killed each year steadily declined throughout the period, with approximately 180 females killed in most seasons. I suspect that the decline in males, proportion of males to females, was from a number of reasons, but part of it because sport hunting was declining, and sport hunters tend to try and target larger bears. Males are larger. The proportion of males to females killed nationally was close to a 2-to-1 ratio for every season until 2021, when the sex ratio was closer to 1-to-1. And that shift appears to be the result of Nunavut adopting a 1-to-1 male to female kill ratio after many years of having a 2-to-1 ratio, plus the loss of sport hunting in 2021. As you can see, overall, the numbers killed annually have trended downwards from a high of 637 in the 2011-2012 hunting season to a low of only 475 in 2021. The trend line is shown in the dotted line. The declining numbers of polar bears killed annually was primarily due to declining numbers killed in Quebec and the ISR. Conversely, the numbers killed in Nunavut remained relatively consistent and trended slightly downwards over the decade. However, the numbers were trending slightly upwards after 2017. As I previously mentioned, there is some uncertainty in the numbers of bears reported killed in Quebec. Although underreporting occurs, it's apparent that the actual Quebec harvest numbers have also been declining. What's happening is there are very few specialized polar bear hunters left in the region, and they're getting old. Plus, hunting specifically for polar bears is expensive. The reducing market value for polar bear hides has diminished the incentive to target polar bears. Given the poor market, low prices for paper polar bear hides, the low prices paid for polar bear hides in recent years, it appears that, at least at the time, at this point, many of the polar bears being killed in Quebec are incidental harvests or bears that approach too close to communities, as opposed to targeted. The number of subsistence kills declined after the 2011-2012 season, but increased in the 2019 and 2020, despite a decrease in total numbers killed. Subsistence kills trended upwards after the 2016 hunting season. The number of bears killed for sport trended sharply upwards after 2014, then dropped dramatically in 2019 and 2020. No bears were hunted for sport at all in 2021. This abrupt crash in sport hunting was the result of the travel restrictions imposed in response to the COVID pandemic. Approximately one half of the sport kills in Nunavut in the 2015 through 2018 seasons were made by U.S. hunters. And that's really interesting because the United States has listed the polar bear under the Endangered Species Act, and people in the U.S. are prohibited from importing any polar bear product. You've got sport hunters in increasing numbers, at least up until the pandemic, coming to Canada to hunt polar bears, but they can't actually take the trophies back home with them. Either you got hunters coming up for the experience, spending $35,000 to go hunt a polar bear, and they're giving the hide and skull and carcass away to locals, or they're getting the trophies taxidermied and then put in storage, hoping that at some point it will be legal for them to bring the trophies back in the United States. Trophies that had been previously hunted to be brought to the country. And suddenly there was this big spike of exports of polar bear. And that happened actually in the late 80s, early 90s. Again, the U.S. prohibited the importation of polar bear hides or anything polar bear parts. Then in the early 90s, the law was changed to allow hunters that had been storing polar bear trophies in Canada to bring them into the country. And there was a sudden spike in exports of polar bear products from Canada to the United States. So it could well be that there is an increasing number of polar bear trophies being stored in Canada, hoping for that point. Okay, so this is one of the most interesting charts as far as I'm concerned. This is a 20-year timeline of the purpose of export for polar bear hides out of Canada. So between 2002 and 2021. You'll see that between 2002 and 2006, almost as many hides were exported as hunting trophies as were exported for commercial purpose. An average of 85 hides were exported commercially each year, compared to an average of 82 hides exported as hunting trophies. The number of hides exported as hunting trophies spiked in 2007, declined sharply in 2008, and then declined steadily in the following years. Between 2010 to 2021, no more than 35 hides were exported as hunting trophies in any one year, and in most years, they were limited to 20 or fewer. Conversely, the number of hides exported for commercial purposes rose sharply after 2007, peaking at 338 hides exported in 2013. At that point, commercial exports accounted for 90% of all hide exports. Then in 2014, commercial exports of hides dropped by 58%. Except for a small spike in 2015, exports of hides for commercial purposes continued to decline in the following years. By 2020, only 75 hides were exported, which is the lowest number exported since before 2002. This was an 80% decline since the 2013 peak in exports. Exports of hides for commercial purposes in 2020 comprised only 38% of all exported hides. And for the first time since 2002, the number of hides exported for personal purposes actually exceeded the number exported for commercial purposes. In 2021, the number of hides exported increased for the first time since 2015, entirely due to a spike in commercial exports, which comprised 82% of hides exported in that year. This is what happened. Before the polar bear was listed on the U.S. Endangered Species Act, there were plenty of U.S. hunters hunting polar bears for sport. Exports to the U.S. accounted for a large proportion of exports. Then the polar bear was listed on the Endangered Species Act. Sport hunting went into a sharp decline. But just coincidentally, at the same time, there was this huge surge in exports for commercial purposes going to China. So the market changed dramatically. Then something happened in 2013. The spike in 2021, however, appears to have been caused by the COVID pandemic. And what it was is because of the pandemic hitting 2020, exports were sharply reduced just because people weren't traveling, people weren't doing stuff, people weren't exporting. So everything slowed down. And the 2021 spike was simply the glut of polar bear hides that didn't get exported in 2020, all being exported along with the 2021 hides. And sure enough, it's not shown here, but in 2022, that number dropped dramatically again, more in line with 2020. Looking at sales of polar bear hides. So polar bear hides may be sold by individuals to other individuals or to brokers or whoever. But historically, the majority of polar bear hides were sold at an auction house. Graphing the sales and the prices for polar bear hides at this auction house, it gives us a pretty good idea of what's happening with the market for polar bear hides. In the years 2012 to 2021, a total of 612 polar bear hides were sold at auction by Fur Harvesters Auction. That's the name. The largest number of hides sold in a single year was 165 in 2012. And that's, of course, when things were peaking. The number sold decreased steadily in the following years, with a notable drop of more than 70% of sales in 2015. Only 19 hides were sold in 2021. Average and top prices paid for polar bear hides peaked in 2013, dropped in 2014, recovered slightly in 2015, then generally declined in the following years. Average prices showed a single year increase in 2019, and top prices started to increase slightly after 2019. The market for polar bear hides started dropping in 2013, and prices lagged by a couple of years, as you would kind of expect. The highest price paid for a polar bear hide in 2013 was 21,000 Canadian dollars, and the average price paid in that year was $7,000. By 2021, the average price for a hide was only $2,300, which was a 67% drop in value since 2013. In trying to figure out what was happening with the polar bear market, I opted to compare it to Canadian exports of what I thought might be a similar species, or at least a species with a similar market. And that's the wolf. So this chart shows exports of wolf hides versus polar bear hides for the same period. The numbers of wolf hides are shown on the left y-axis, and polar bear hide numbers are shown on the right y-axis. Prices for farmed mink hit record highs in 2013 and then declined by more than 50% in 2014. And within the fur industry, it's pretty well known that wild fur prices tend to follow mink prices. So wild fur prices followed the downward trend for mink price. Canadian exports of hides from other CITES listed species like bobcat, Canadian lynx, river otter, and wolf also declined dramatically after 2013 and 2014, same as polar bear. However, exports of those species recovered markedly in 2019 before crashing again in 2020, presumably because of the COVID pandemic. The declining exports of polar bear hides after 2013 correlated with the drop in global market for furs. But exports of polar bear hides did not recover, and exports also did not recover. What I was told by people in the fur industry is that, again, where mink prices go, where mink sales go, everything else follows. And that when mink prices and the mink market for mink crash, that the high value hides, the ones that are just bought for luxury purposes, are the first to decline because of the most expensive, and that would be polar bear. But I don't really buy that. And as you can see, something happened, but polar bear did not recover when other hides did. There's a fundamental difference between the market for polar bear hides and the market for other wild fur species. High quality polar bear hides sell for much higher prices than the more common species and are used to make expensive luxury rugs. They're not typically cut up and made into garments in the way that most furs are. So it's unclear to what degree the market decline for polar bear hides was due to the fur market decline, or whether both markets were impacted by other influences. Interestingly enough, exports of all four species increased again in 2021, but of course, the pandemic had a big impact on that. Of the 5,329 polar bears reported killed in Canada between 2011 and 2021, 27% were exported as hides or skulls by December 2021. This is based on the unique hunting tag numbers assigned to every bear that's hunted in Canada. Mention that the database run by the Canadian Wildlife Service for polar bears is the best species trade database going, the best I've seen. So every bear that's hunted is entered into this database, and it has the unique tag number, where it was hunted, and then if it's exported, it will have all the associated information saying to what country it was exported. So in that database, you can say, okay, this bear was hunted in Nunavut on this date. Its hide was eventually exported to this country on this date. And you can say whether it was hunted, the purpose of why it was traded. You can say whether, for instance, the skull and the hide were traded together or if they were separated, etc. Less than 1/2 of the bears killed in any one season were subsequently exported. The highest proportion of exports to kills was recorded in 2012. Was recorded for the 2012-2013 hunting season, when the polar bear hide market was strongest. In that season, 617 polar bears were killed across Canada, and by December 2021, 48% of those had been exported. As you'd expect, the numbers of bears exported generally declined from the older to the more recent hunting season. If a bear is killed in 1 year, it doesn't mean it will be exported that year. In fact, it generally wouldn't be. It also doesn't mean it's exported the next year. You know, you could have a bear hunted in 2011, but it's not exported until 2020. Exports of bears killed in the different seasons will therefore increase as additional hides and skulls still in Canada are eventually exported. And this will especially apply to those taken in more recent huntings. The chart on the left shows the numbers of bears killed in each season for reasons other than sport, compared with the numbers killed in that season and exported for purposes other than hunting trophies. Exports of bears killed in other seasons are not shown. Both chart lines show a declining trend for the period. The data used for this chart includes kills for defense, miscellaneous kills, and illegal kills, most of which would not be the trend for exportable hides would likely trend more steadily downward. The chart on the right shows the numbers of bears killed in each season for sport compared with the numbers killed in that season and exported as hunting trophies. Bears killed for sport would not normally be exported for any other purpose. After the 2014-2015 hunting season, the numbers of bears hunted for sport in Canada increased sharply. I pointed that out before. And again, there were no polar bears hunted in Canada for sport in the 2020-2021 hunting season, and no bears killed in 2021 had been exported by December 31st, 2021. So now looking at the destination countries, this gives you a 20-year timeline for exports by country. As I mentioned, prior to 2008, the U.S. was the single biggest importer of polar bear hides, mainly as hunting trophies. By 2009, only 3 hides were exported to the United States, and no hides have been exported to the U.S. since, except for a single hide exported in 2018 for use in a traveling exhibition. The boom in commercial exports of hides after 2007 was driven by the rising Chinese market for hides. In 2008, a total of 46 hides were exported to China, with 36 being for commercial purposes. By 2010, 194 hides were exported to China and exceeded the numbers exported to all other countries combined. Most of the exports to China were for commercial purposes. In 2013, when hide exports peaked, 82% of all hide exports were destined for China, and almost all were for commercial purposes. In the following years, the steady decline in numbers of hides exported was primarily due to the rapidly declining Chinese market for polar bear hides. In 2018, China imported fewer hides than did other countries combined for the first time since 2010. China imported only 40 hides in each of 2019 and 2020. The 40 hides exported to China in 2019 was the fewest since 2007. Now, despite the lower export numbers, China has been the single biggest destination country for polar bear hides exported from Canada in every year since 2008. In 2021, the number of hides exported to China increased for the first time since 2015, although the increase was very small. Numbers, as I mentioned earlier, have now dropped. Exports in 2022 dropped to the same level as 2020. Exports of polar bear hides to countries other than China and the United States peaked in 2004, and then they've been declining pretty much ever since. That decline is not consistent, and exports fluctuated in volume from year to year, but overall, there has been a steady decline in exports of polar bear hides. In the years 2012 to 2021, polar bear hides were exported from Canada to a total of 52 different countries. China, as I mentioned, was the single biggest export destination for polar bear hides in 2012 to 2021 and imported almost twice as many hides as all other countries combined. Overall, China imported 65% of all the polar bear hides exported from Canada in the study period. Other than China, the most common destination countries for polar bear hides were Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Norway, and Russia. Collectively, those 6 countries imported 24% of all the hides exported from Canada. These countries and China collectively imported 90% of all hides. Exports were not consistent year to year, and only China, France, Norway, and Russia imported hides in every year. More hides were exported to Norway than any other country except China, although far fewer were exported to Norway than China. China imported the most hides in every individual year, and in most years imported more hides than all other countries. However, the numbers of hides exported to China peaked at 294 in 2012 and steadily declined in the following years. The overall decline in total numbers of hides exported from Canada was primarily due to that rapidly decreasing annual export numbers to China. More than 50% of the hides exported to Belgium and Denmark occurred in single years. So you would have a spike in exports, but it wasn't consistent. Overall, exports to countries other than China declined in 2012 to 2021, although they did not decline as steeply as did exports to China over the same period. The export of hides to Norway is interesting because exports to Norway were sporadic, with very few hides exported in 2012, 14, 16, and 20, followed by sharp spikes in numbers in the immediately following years. These spikes were primarily due to significant exports to only one or two importers each year. Rather than indicating changes in the Norwegian market for hides, these spikes appear to be caused by Norwegian dealers replenishing their available stock. They don't import the next year because they're selling off the stock that they brought in the previous year. The 2018 spike in exports was due to both an export of 21 hides to Norway and an odd export of 25 hides to Denmark. Half of the hides exported to Norway in 2018 were exported via a permit issued in late December 2017. So it was just luck that the permit was issued in 2017, but they weren't actually exported till 2018. As previously noted, in 2021, exports of polar bear hides increased for the first time since 2015, and a significant portion of this increase consisted of hides exported to a single Norwegian importer, who probably would have imported them the year before if it wasn't for COVID. Exports of hides to China also increased in 2021, but the increase was modest, only 11 hides more than exported to China the previous year. Canadian exports of hides from other species also spiked in 2021, and this followed increased prices for mink and wild furs in 2020. It's possible that 2021 upturn in exports also signified a resurging market for polar bear hides. Really, it was more, again, to just the COVID pandemic causing a bit of a glut in exports. And I'll just summarize it in a few points. Most polar bears killed in Canada are taken in Nunavut for subsistence purposes. The numbers of polar bears killed in Canada have been declining since 2012, primarily the result of diminishing harvest levels to two jurisdictions, Quebec and the ISR, which is Yukon and Northwest Territories. Most of the polar bears killed annually in Canada are not exported, and the commercial market for polar bear hides crashed in 2014 and continued to decline throughout the decade. This is evident from auction sales for polar bear hides, the prices paid for the hides, and the number of hides exported from Canada. The boom and bust of the hide market was driven by the Chinese market. Outside of China, the market has actually been declining since 2004. Polar bear hide market decline correlates with a global fur market decline. Although the ultimate cause of the decline is unclear, sport hunting of polar bears resurged after 2015 before being shut down due to the COVID pandemic. That resurgence was being driven by increasing numbers of U.S. hunters who, as I mentioned, cannot import their hunting trophies back into the United States. Exports of polar bear hides increased slightly in 2021, which correlated with increasing global fur prices, but was mainly driven by a recurring export to Norway, plus delays caused by the COVID pandemic. In this presentation, I question whether or not the 2021 increase signified a resurging market for polar bear hides, and it did not. As I mentioned, the 2022 export levels dropped back to the same as 2020. Any questions after that huge glurg of information?
I guess I was curious about a question. You showed some of the other countries in the EU, and I was curious to know how the EU has normally voted at the CITES tops, because I know a lot of us think about and understand the impact that the seal restrictions have had on the EU.
The EU is an interesting case because there's about 35 countries, 36, something like that. But there's a definite difference between, there's like two blocks of countries. There's one block led by Germany, the UK, Netherlands, which are really opposed to wildlife trade, very animal welfare driven and such. And then you have the more southern countries like Italy, Greece, who are less so. So you tend to have these two blocks competing.
Yeah.
The blocks that really are opposed to wildlife trade tend to be the ones that are wealthiest and have an awful lot of say within the EU. So for the first COP, the first meeting when the polar bear was proposed, the EU did not support, and that was partly because the US kind of dropped it at the last minute, and nobody was expecting that, and it was confusing to parties because Canada and the US tend to work very closely, and all of a sudden you had the US and Canada on polar opposite. So the EU basically weren't comfortable with making decisions, so they just simply, I can't remember. No, they did poll at the next meeting when the U.S. proposed it again. The EU couldn't come to a decision because it's pretty clear that the science said it didn't meet the criteria for Appendix 1. But the emotional side, the animal welfare groups, conservation groups, the political feeling was they wanted to list it on Appendix 1. So you had the side saying they want to save polar bears and they want to list them on Appendix 1, but their own science folks were saying that's not the problem. That's not going to do it. So they came up with option C, and the EU proposed a different. They submitted another proposal, and that was, I believe, it was to leave it on Appendix 2, but with a 0 export quota, which means it's still listed on Appendix 2, but you can't export. Well, actually, that's more strict than Appendix 1, because with Appendix 1, you can export for non-commercial purposes. So it would have shut down. It would have been just as bad, if not worse, for the Inuit. And so Canada said, no, we're not going to support that. And the US, their response was, no, we wanted Appendix 1, so they're not going to support that. So it was kind of like nobody liked the EU option. So the EU ended up abstaining. It was like, we want ours. It was defeated so soundly. So then the EU just abstained from the next.
The other thing that was really striking me from this report is the 67% drop into value since 2013. And I know that the exports to China obviously declined. And you also mentioned meat prices, but any other insights and thoughts on why the prices would have dropped so high? Or
I have spent so much time thinking about this. It's the one thing that drives me crazy that I don't have the answer to. Everything else I've been able to sort out. And that's something I've been trying to figure out since day one. I have a pretty good idea what happened, but I can't prove it. So I think it was a combination of things. The drop in fur prices, sure, that would have had an impact. The fact that the market was declining anyhow was a factor. But boy, China, it was going great guns until suddenly, click, it changed. Something happened in 2013. Now, I do know there was a crackdown on Chinese fur distributors, or a couple of Chinese fur distributors, but I've never managed to get any good details on exactly what happened or why.